Good morning. How is everyone today? Please sign in to chat with your full name and your institution. I'll give everyone a few minutes to sign on. If you're just signing on, please go to the chat and type your full name and your institution, please. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sherry Massoni. I am the Associate Vice President for Workforce and Community Education at Harford Community College. And it's my pleasure to introduce Patrick Dempsey. I'm going to read a bio on Patrick. So Patrick is the Director of the Office of Digital Teaching and Learning at Loyola University in Maryland. He has published and presented widely on instructional design, communities of practice, inquiry, and transformative learning, and quality assurance in online classes. He is also the author of Creating Transformative Online Communities in Higher Education. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Patrick.
Thank you so much. Great to see so many folks here. This is going to be highly interactive, so I'm going to need you to be in the chat the whole time. I'm going to be interacting with the chat. If I don't get to, I'll try to get to a lot of the comments. Again, highly interactive. And if I don't, we'll have some time at the end just for some questions. But I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll get right into the presentation. All right, so becoming learning driven, a framework for creating learner driven course activities. So hopefully this is some conceptual stuff and then some really practical applications for us. So I start with a story that happened about a year ago. We were coming off the pandemic and you know, everyone was really an expert now on online, quote unquote. And so this instructor emailed my office and this was the question. Several of my students are now in isolation. So we'd come back to campus and now some of the students were not in the class anymore. Should be ready for this, right? We had a whole whatever year of this. Next part of the letter says, and I have a student in each class recording the class lecture on their phones. I mean, I guess that's a workaround to solving the problem of students not being in the class. But here's a problem, right? So the videos are extremely huge. I mean, the person's talking for an hour and a half. The students are recording it on their phones, eating up their memory. And then that's sort of amusing. So this instructor realizes, well, it's possible to record in the classroom, except the classrooms aren't set up. And I'm sure we all had that experience where we were trying to teach and facilities did their best, but it didn't always work. And the instructor would like to interact with students, even through a chat like we're going to be doing in Zoom here, but it's just too much for the instructor to do. So here's the story. It's the pandemic. We're back. Students aren't there, hoping that some pedagogy has shifted. The only thing that seems to have shifted is the instructor realizes now that a student can record the lecture and post it online for students, sort of like a modified flipped classroom or something. So based on the conversation, that email, and wherever your knowledge is at this point, identify in the chat where the instructor is on this spectrum from instructor-driven to learner-driven. 1 to 5, 1 being instructor-driven, 5 being learner-driven. And this is going to be a cue for you throughout. When you see one of these boxes, these like dark purple boxes, you're putting it in the chat. Two's a very, very generous, very charitable twos here. Oops, sorry about that. Twos. Okay, a couple more responses. Just want to make sure you're all typing. I know it's fun to text when you're in the presentations. We can empathize with our students. All right, we're going with 2. Okay, now this is a safe space. Overall, identify where your institution is on this spectrum. Currently ones, okay. 3, Amelia's feeling like they're up there. Excellent, ones from WWCC. Anne's putting a 3 in there. So 3 is the highest, we've gotten that twice. So one more question about this, the little setup. Thanks, Kelly, for the 2. What are some things you think your institution could do that would increase that rating by a 0.5 point? Just off the top of your head. I mean, it's not what the presentation is about, but we're in hopefully powers of some influence here. Maybe what are some things that you could do? And Kimmy, if I'm saying that right, do you mean like teaching policies, like expectations? So Amber's doing the, this more of like from the instructional design team, or even a template maybe that gets put out. Again, more like expectations, workshops and mentoring for sure. Training, thank you, Denise. Yeah, Doug, that's the challenge, right? Is like, how do we promote it? And hopefully some of this information here will be helpful. Some of this, hopefully we can go back to Christy's professional development, or if you can be mentors, like Amelia's saying, that would be great. So hopefully this will be helpful for you. These are definitely some things that we can do, and let's try to put some of this in action today. So here's our agenda. It's going to follow our 3 objectives. We're going to explain the difference in instructor roles in instructor-driven and learner-driven models, and that's going to give like a foundation, a theoretical foundation. And then we're going to have a framework that we can use to actually evaluate activities in our own courses or others if we're mentoring, to make activities more learner driven. That's going to be super helpful and something for you to take home there. And then we'll see an example for module objective 3 of utilizing a framework to create a learner driven course activities. So we'll have a framework for it, and then we'll actually get into a little bit of an activity where we see how that can work out at a very practical level. So what are some things, some ideas that you'd like me to touch on? As you can see, I'm very interactive with the chat. I'll do my best to kind of meet you where you are throughout this presentation. So if there's anything that drew you to this conversation, could you list that in the chat, just so I can use this for some information? Think about it throughout our time. Tools, okay. Definitely, yeah, as we talk about the framework, I think that'll be a good opportunity to get some tools. Yeah, so as we go through, in particular, probably the first objective, I think we're going to see a lot of those roadblocks when we're talking about like metaphors and roles and competencies. So tools, roadblocks. Yeah, and Doug, I mean, at the end, hopefully we're going to have this framework, and then we're going to have some really simple things that we can do for instructors in a very practical way to implement that. Interaction cycles, that's sort of like an overall program, like a planning in your course of like how I'm going to interact with the students, how they're going to interact with each other. Is that what you're referring to, Amber? Cool. So some tools, some roadblocks, some strategies, and just overall thinking of this as a holistic whole. So hopefully I'll keep that in mind. And just real quick, last question before we get into objective 1, where do you feel you are in your knowledge of any of this stuff? You see the objectives. And again, the goal would be hopefully we're getting to maybe 3s or 4s by the end of this thing. Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, there's not a ton on learner drivenness. I mean, if you use UDL, the universal design, there's a lot on student-centered, but not a ton on drivenness. All right, T. Miller, 8, don't know your name, but thank you. Definitely gonna opine. If people ask questions that I don't get to, please use your expertise. So let's talk about the differences in roles. And I want to start off here with a question. So on the left of this slide, you're going to see Outlier, Quantic, and Google Career Certificates. I'll just ask, what's your institution's awareness of these competitors? I'll talk a little bit about them as you rate that. You can see they don't know. If they knew, they don't care. And then 3, they're strategically caring. Outlier is from the makers of Masterclass, offered through the University of Pittsburgh. Professors from the prestigious universities throughout the United States teach courses, a growing catalog of courses, really like your gen ed, high enrollment courses. And like if you fail, you get a refund. There's peer support. It's like $400, $500 for the 3 credit course. Totally transferable credits, again, because they're coming from the University of Pittsburgh. Quantic, as you can see on that slide, 1 in 3 students in their program have earned their MBA for free. So this is a free online college education, and Google Career Certificates for the community college folks here. You can sign up through Coursera, $49 a month or so, and you can get a $70,000 a year job in like 2 or 3 months. So some don't knows, never heard of it. Definitely most of us are not strategically planning. My school definitely does not. I don't believe this is on our strategic radar. And this will make a lot of sense. We're gonna come back to this. So just remember, these are mostly non-facilitated courses. They're not really instructors, even though Outlier has a recorded instructor. It's very much self-paced, very much that sort of learner, self-paced, accomplish the course on your own sort of thing. So let's look at the practices and a framework for looking at practices from instructor-driven to learner-driven. So in instructor-driven models, and this is going to talk a little bit about the roadblocks, and we'll get more to that. Pedagogical choices are singular. It's like whatever the instructor wants. The learning objectives are there basically to meet program and assessment needs, maybe course needs. The direction of the course is entirely predetermined. There's no freedom for the students really to do anything. The sole purpose of assessment is to measure performance, to sort of rank students at the end of the semester. And the philosophy obviously behind this is to sort. It's this whole idea that these are college students and we're gonna have to have a normal curve, a normal distribution at the end of the term. And that's how we know the course was successful. So learner-centered gets better at this. We start to use some different pedagogical choices to help students, again, a UDL sort of framework. The learning objectives really drive the whole learning process. That's the goal. That's how we know it's successful. There is some usually opportunity for a student to choose something to do, a pathway. Students are often selecting from in that sense, where it's like, do you want to do a portfolio or do you want to do a video? So we'll give them like 2 choices. Assessment becomes a little bit more for the student. We try to make it meaningful for them. And the philosophy is not, I'm trying to sort the students on the normal distribution. I'm trying to make sure that all students succeed, which is great. It's a great goal. In learner-drivenness, and this is really tricky, it's divergent. We are willing to use different pedagogical techniques for different student needs. Our learning objectives actually become a starting point for the learning. We use them as a jumping off point for students to engage with the course objectives or the outcomes we hope that they would have. The direction of the course is students actually have the opportunity to maybe create some pathways in a sense, and we'll talk about that at the very last objective, how that works. Students are now selecting things. So maybe the resources the students are bringing in, the 10 readings for the week, and then students are rifling through those as opposed to here's 3 and choose your favorite one. Assessment is for the community. So you're going to do a lot of things in an interaction cycle like Amber was talking about. So we're displaying our work. I like to use the example, the metaphor of like the kindergarten classroom, where the entire classroom is coded with student work because that's so essential to learning, the sharing aspect, learning from each other, to the college classroom, where the only purpose of your work is to turn it in to the instructor. And it's just a great visual to see the difference between instructor-driven and learner-driven. And then the whole philosophy is like, how do I take what these learners are doing and then make more from it in amplifying? So that's overall, this is how we can think. These are some frameworks to think about what are the differences in practices? And we're going to get into the differences in roles coming up. So based on these definitions, are you sticking with your original rating of your institution or yourself? Are you lowering it? Are you raising it? Do you feel like maybe you were more learner-centered than learner-driven? Maybe even further away from learner-driven than you thought you were? And learner-centered is a great place to be, Amber, for sure. The learner-driven is, I feel like it's an aspirational goal that kind of pushes us a little bit past learner-centered, very hard to implement. But again, we'll have some practical strategies to do it. This can be a number response. And if you're not putting in a number response, I'll just assume you're not listening. And Amber and I will just continue this conversation for the next 35 minutes. So you just guilt people, shame people into responding. Pretending to be too, I like that. More on the left of learner-centered, good, Amelia. It's essential that we're all communicating here, I think. Thank you. Sherry, thank you for learner-centered, still a 2, excellent. So let's tie this back to this idea of these programs that are disruptive challengers to all, really, no matter who our institution is, these are disruptive challengers. And the interesting thing is, even though there's not an instructor in the course, they're much more learner-centered than most of our institutions, because you're doing this. Your goal is to get a job. Your goal is to have an outcome that's meaningful for you. The goal, the success of each of these programs, like Outlier gives you a refund if you don't pass, their success is supporting you through the end. The whole purpose of the course is for the student. You get to choose your pathways. You get to choose how fast you go, how slow you go. In some of these, you get to choose if you want support from peers or tutors or not. So it's these models are very much learner-centered. And even more so in many cases, even though there's not an instructor, than our institutions. So based on this understanding, what are some opportunities that institutions have to differentiate themselves, to still create value for their customers? These are these big questions. So I'm the director of the Office of Digital Teaching and Learning, and someone asked, how do you define the role of an instructional designer? And then I was like, I have no idea. Even though that's what I do, is I do it and I manage a team of them. That's good. Face-to-face impacts is a good one. Yes, contact. I mean, I think this is it, right? Interaction. Like, we have the opportunity for these relationships, as Sherry's saying. Even we can do this online. Like, we can do online better in some senses. I mean, they have more money behind their online programs, but it's the connection, like Amelia's saying. And that's where we're learner-driven. We have a sensitivity to the learners and we're responding to them. So again, learner-centered does that, but learner-drivenness is going to even take that sensitivity and that responsiveness to a next level. So let's see, again, we'll get at some of the roadblocks here. So this was the framework again, and thank you for that participation. Now let's look at this actual objective. So we needed this kind of to see what the differences are to set this up. So what are some metaphors that you would use for teachers or instructors in the instructor-driven model? How would you describe their role, instructor's role in an instructor-driven model? Sage on the stage. Thank you, T. Miller 8. Talking head. Sherry, that's good. I mean, that's me right now. The authority, leader, excellent. Doug's looking for, he's looking for total commitment from his students, complete allegiance. Wah, 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 from Amber, excellent. So those are all great. I just go with subject matter expert because, like, no matter all of those, right, they're not actually, like, definitely I'm your captain, but they're just bringing the content knowledge, right? Not necessarily pedagogical knowledge, even though obviously they're teachers. Yeah, so and we'll talk about these skills too, to that last comment. So how about some metaphors that you can maybe predict for learner-centered, learner-driven, excuse me, instructors? Facilitator, excellent. Those were two back-to-back facilitators. Learning guide, excellent. Partner, love that. experiential mentor, team member, awesome. So like even a partner and a mentor, guide on the side, excellent. So in a few slides, you'll see a little reference on the bottom right. They did this, Martin et al. Did a number of studies on this through OLC, Online Learning Consortium, about what effective online instructors do. And so these are the roles that they saw, and metaphors, really. Coach, guide, mentor, partner. Yeah, so all those are here, right? Subject matter expert, of course, you have to have that. A course manager, now we're getting into those technical skills. Course designer, definitely those technical, pedagogical skills. And then those things that we were just talking about, facilitator, mentor, coach. So let's put these together with the practices. And there's sort of a good line up here. They sort of align. So for divergent practices, you need to be a subject matter expert, of course, because you need to be able to know where students need to go. And I need to know the content so well. But of course, I need pedagogical knowledge to be able to choose different options for different students. As a course manager, it's going to help me understand what role objectives play in the course. As a course designer, of course, we want to help students create pathways. And so we need that course designer skill. We're going to facilitate that selection. We're going to be the mentor of the community, and we're going to be a coach to help amplify the success of all the students. So the big difference in the roles, obviously, are subject matter expert to subject matter expert, course manager, course designer, facilitator, mentor, coach. And those are definitely some of the biggest roadblocks. All like, how do you do this as a professional development? As that comment said, what sort of institutional resources do we need to do this? So I think, we're all at institutions with limited resources. So we become the agents of change in our circles of influence. And hopefully we take this information back with us and we can do some practical things with it in our own area and then with our peers. So that's our first objectives. Now we know the difference. And now I'm just going to ask you real quick to explain the difference in your own words between instructor-driven and learner-driven courses, or instructor-driven, learner-driven roles. And if we can't do it, I've totally failed objective one. Active participation from Team Miller, excellent. Choice and domain over learning, yeah. Responsibility and authority. Which is, I mean, handing and putting this responsibility in the students is, in my experience, very challenging. The students definitely have a hard time, and that's another roadblock, getting used to the idea that, hey, like, this course is for you. Like, I teach, I also teach in the grad school of ed, and I teach education course where they learn APA, and I'll give like APA quizzes or mini lessons where they learn the content, and students will get it 100 on the quiz, and then they'll do terrible in their application. I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, it doesn't matter to me if you get 100 on the quiz. Like, it's literally no bearing on me. So yeah, so the shifting the ownership is the goal, and it's also one of the big challenges. So let's get to the second objective, and let's evaluate courses. And this we can do this ourselves. There's going to be a worksheet at the end for you. First, we'll go through it together, and then you can use something to kind of assess how you are. So here are, let's see, what is this, seven different things. So the purpose of a course or an activity, the objectives of the course, the activity, the approach that's taken, the choice that's given, the application, submission, and feedback. So this is a framework for us to evaluate how well we're doing in these. And we'll look at each of those, and we'll kind of have the opposition to see what the difference is. So first, what's the purpose of an instructor-driven activity versus a learner-driven activity? And usually an instructor-driven activity is repeating information. It's doing that midterm and that final. Did you understand those things? And learner-driven is we want students to take that essential, that information is essential, but we want them to do something with it. The objectives in the instructor-driven, they're the ceiling. Like once you hit it, you've done it. In learner-driven, we're going to use them as the floor. They're going to be the springboard for learning, and we'll see how that plays during the last objective. So instructor-driven obviously is going to be summative, like almost everything's going to be summative, used for sorting, of course, and then learner-driven, obviously formative, and just driving towards continued improvement. So obviously there's no choice, and in the instructor-driven assignment, it's just you're going to do this, and then the students are going to be able to choose they're going to be able to offer their ideas of how they can demonstrate their knowledge, still according to some objectives that you've all agreed on. So the application is to the course only in an instructor-driven model, right? Like it's just you're getting the grade in this course because you have to get a grade in this course. And in learner-driven, we are trying to make it a personal application or even a communal or a societal application. Like what difference does this overall make? The submission, and this is, I think, one of the most important one, is entirely private for an instructor-driven, which means almost everything students do is given to you as the instructor, and you grade it and you give it back, and it has no benefit to anyone. It really has very little benefit to the student because it was just theirs. They got their grade and they moved on. But in learner-driven, think that kindergarten class, all the assessments, all the activities, all the feedback we're giving also is going to be public. We're doing it for the learning community. And so there's a difference in any feedback that you get in instructor-driven is instructional. This should have been 3 pages. I wish that you had synthesized this way. Your grammar's wrong. And in learner-driven, you're really getting an individualized feedback about how you can amplify, how you can coach, how you can mentor that student. So big differences there. So at this point, I'm going to share a document that I'd like us to hop into, and hope this is the right document. And so I want you to think about some activities that you have that or ways that you can make the purpose of what's an example of in your that the purpose is instructor driven, and how do you make it more learner driven? Is there an assignment that you do? Is there application of an assignment that you do that's instructor driven right now, and that you hope to make learner driven? So just put some ideas, and so an idea would be for an approach being instructor driven would be like the midterm would be instructor driven, and instead of a midterm could be like a portfolio, so that would be more learner driven. So hopefully I'm still sharing the PowerPoint so you can see the framework as a whole. What are some ways that you can take, again, maybe that midterm as an individual submission? What are some things that you can do to make that assignment more communal? Excellent. And so the Badger, I mean, that's one of my favorite things to do. It's definitely learner-centered, but it can be learner-driven. And we really want to, and it's going to come out in this last objective of how we do this, how we make sure they're still doing the objectives of the course, or the objectives that are even meaningful to them, and then, but giving them the choice to do things. Oops. Peer review is excellent form. Also do share this. I share this in the presentation I do on discussion forums. But so one thing that I do is a ton of peer review. I basically don't do any assignments that are just coming to me anymore. It's just always some peer review. But often that can be a little tiring, like week after week, or maybe they're just not ready to give good peer review, although I scaffold that, which you'll see in our example. But so what I'll do is everyone will post, like, say, their artifact, whatever it is that they created, and then they just respond to themselves. And the prompt is to like review 3 of your peers and then highlight good examples of X, explain why you thought that was a good example of X. So it actually becomes a really good learning opportunity. We know in those like discussion forums that the responses can be really lame. So having like a self-response where you're forced to look at identify 3 good habits, 3 bad habits, whatever it might be. Yeah, it's a really good alternative to the peer review. The objectives is a great one. I know instructors will take the objectives, and then what they'll do is like, they'll say there's an activity that they're doing this for. So they'll have some objectives listed, and then let's say it's like a project, an application project. They'll find maybe from a previous course or from some like a web resource, a good example of what this application project looked like, and then ask students to identify the things that they believe make it really effective. And that actually becomes the rubric. So it was like well organized, it used graphics to support their understanding, it had references. And so as a course, as a class, that's like that metacognitive, like, oh, this is what I'm going to be evaluated on. And then this is how I'm going to actually proceed in creating the project. It's a great way to make the objectives actually completely learner driven. But again, you're starting off with a framework. You're saying, okay, here are the objectives that we usually use for this. Here's a model assignment. So you're structuring it, but then you're giving them autonomy, and that's going to be our next objective here. So let's just do another minute here, and these are great suggestions, and you can access this after if that's helpful for you. So in the chat, I'm just going to put in a sheet that is the slide that's on the screen right now. And I'm sorry, wasn't on the right one. So I put in the chat, this is just a Google sheet that you can do this. So you can go and just rank some assignments, like, is my purpose for more repeating information, or is it closer to creating meaning? And as a really simple way of doing this, if you're at a teaching learning unit, or if you're like a chair, or you just have a sphere of influence, you could say, hey, let's just pick one assignment in each of our courses and do this. And let's see where we landed. And then let's pick 1 or 2 of these things. Maybe we change the approach and the submission. And let's just try to make it a little bit more learner driven. And it's a really practical way to start implementing this. So they're entirely, Beth, this is entirely self-paced. So there's not an instructor at all. Just want to clarify that. And yeah, I think in inclusive teaching practices and learner-driven practices, what you're saying about the optional reflection and application activities, if we think that's helpful, then we should sort of make them required. And we can create them in a way that allows the students to still have the choice to do things, but again, in the context of, and I think one of the ways that we always do is in the reflection is, so often, like if you want students to create a multimedia presentation, or that's an option, right? Like I'm not a multimedia expert. I have no way to assess that. So what we have them do is that reflection aspect, like explain what elements of this demonstrated these, like list 10 concepts that you captured, course concepts that you captured in your graphic media, multimedia thing, and why those elements that you designed effectively communicate or convey your understanding of those principles or concepts. So there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but it forces them to explain their thinking about those concepts and how whatever they created is a good demonstration of that. And so it really just, so then you're just seeing, did you pick up 10 concepts? And I don't necessarily have to agree with your reasoning. As long as you did and you have some rationale for tying it. Again, I don't know how that would auto grade, but that is a good way to do that. So from that, I mean, that was great. We had a little activity. We started thinking about our own courses, and you walked away with hopefully a worksheet that you could start using in a really practical way for objective 2. So the final objective, utilizing a framework to create learner-driven activities. And I've hinted at this a few times already, this idea of structured autonomy. And yeah, auto grading is definitely the hurdle. I don't know how to do those things. I mean, that's definitely not my expertise of fully asynchronous, if anyone else is. Structured autonomy. So we have structure on the one hand and we have autonomy on the other hand. So, and we're going to look at an example of this. So in structure, we're going to use objectives to drive learning. We're going to use steps to direct learning and instructional statements to define learning. And I'm using this example of structured autonomy in this specifically an example of assignment instructions, because learner-drivenness is really all about the activities. It's all about having students engage actively with the content, as again, opposed to that passive sage on the stage, subject matter expert just giving information. And the autonomy is going to come in as we're ensuring that there's an opportunity for students to individually apprehend it. This is not to say that this is not a communal sharing, but individually that I get it, that I'm taking some action that's going to force me to dive into the content and to learn it on my own and in a way that makes sense to me. And then of course that application. So I'm going to paste one more thing in the chat that we're going to comment on. So this is a sample instruction of what I would consider a well-structured learner-driven discussion forum with peer review. And again, hopefully I'm still sharing that slide and I have opened up the document. So the first thing you're going to see are sort of the instructions for what we're trying to do here. It says review the document, highlight text that captures one of the structured or autonomy principles, or you can reply to someone if they've already highlighted the text, and then add a new comment or a reply. And for each highlight, identify the learner-driven principle or principles you're seeing, structured autonomy or anything else that's ringing a bell, application, submission, whatever, and explain how that principle could propel learner-drivenness. And then I've given some examples already to see where it's structure, to see objectives, to see the steps, and to see statements, to see the difference here. And so the objectives to drive learning, I'll just talk about these as you kind of explore. Again, these are the floor of the learning. So the objective is the assignment. It's to develop an actionable research question. That's the objective. And to do that, I think we get really caught up in instructional design, if we're familiar with taxonomies, with like develop is just develop. It's a high level taxonomic level, and that's all we're doing. But really to do anything, to remember at a very low level, or to define at a very low level, often it takes me often to create something that helps me remember it. And so what we're doing with objectives to drive learning is we're thinking about, okay, here's this objective, develop an actionable research question. But then we're thinking about all the ways that we can help learners really solidify this information, to really solidify what it takes, what it means to do this correctly. So we're talking about identifying topics and gaps and values, even like that would be important. So we're walking them through a thought process that is much more complicated than just develop an actionable research question. Like, again, that's the ceiling, you wrote the question. I don't know if you actually get what it takes to do that. And so that's what this using objectives to drive learning is all about. The steps are super important. You can see there's just 2 steps to starting the post, but then it's a stepwise process. Define, identify, explain, and we're walking them through the cognitive steps. But you can see, even though all the students are doing the same thing, they're going to come up with much different responses. And they're even going to understand these things slightly different based on what their needs are. And statements over questions. This is one of the most successful learner-driven principles, or really instructional design principles. So if we were to ask, like I say, why is research important? That's a question that students, it helps us understand things. But here we're getting to that personal application. Here we're getting to that learner-driven. Identify 3 ways research can make a difference in the field of educational leadership. This is what it's from. They're thinking about it in their context. It's not just research in being important or research being important to education. It's how, like, in your context of educational leadership, and not even just broadly, like you're at this school, you're at this level, you have this title. So this allows them, and again, statements over questions are going to allow them to do that. So I'm just going to, with that overview, let you keep exploring and then take like 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes of just making a few comments of where you're seeing principles, where you're having questions, really translate the knowledge that we've gained to this point in our exploration here. And you can do questions in the chat if you have any, or just comments on the Google Doc. Just do 2 more minutes or so of you thinking, consternating, reflecting on cold calling on students and they don't respond, and the tumbleweeds are blowing across the virtual classroom. So I think it's to start, Amber, with that sheet and where you're really comfortable making changes. So the practice, I would say that the practice of statements over questions is one of the most important ones when you're creating activities, because you're really helping learners drive their learning by kind of predicting the sorts of things that they need to do. It was that example of that optional reflection and optional activity, like making the things that are optional that like the successful students do, the A students do, making those required, and then thinking of creating them in a way that allows for structure and autonomy. So that does take some time. For me, the beauty of it is I end up grading on a logistical, almost every assignment on a logistical rubric, that it's, did you follow the instructions? And like completely, mostly, somewhat, limited, and not. And so on the front end, it's more time. And on the back end, it's a ton less time. And it really helps to get to that point where you're giving that differentiation value, that individualized feedback, because I'm no longer saying, to develop your research question, you really should have identified a gap. You really should have shared your values. I would have liked to have seen you interact in this way. So you're front loading all of the expectations, instructions, and structure and autonomy. And then at the end, you're just simply grading on whether they did it, and then giving them feedback on what you learned from them. Because even in this example, it's super structured. So as an instructor, you can skim this and see that they got it, and then maybe pick an area or two to give them feedback on. So it's going to save you a ton of time, like a ton of time. Once the semester starts, you have very little to do, but it takes a lot of time up front. But I would never teach another way. I got so sick of giving the same feedback to everyone. I was like, oh, this is my fault. Like, obviously, I'm not explaining what I want them to do. And then making it meaningful is, in the course evaluations, it's always, I teach ED 600. This is Foundations of Educational Research, the most boring course in the program. And because they're doing research on their topic, because I'm trying to help them do further research and understand how to do a research project around their topic, they come out loving it. They understand that they can apply the skills that they learned to every other class. And more importantly, most students already affect change in their classroom because they understand what it takes to do research, even at a very action research low level. So it is exciting if you do this right to really think about that structure and the autonomy. So those were the objectives. Hopefully they were helpful. I'm going to see how helpful they were. So imagine a colleague that wasn't able to join you, half the people that signed up but didn't come today. Reach out to see and say, what did you learn today? So in a few words, summarize your key takeaways. Excellent, Anne. Yeah, I think the frameworks are a little bit helpful if you kind of cater them to whoever your audience might be. I like that, Doug. It really is a good point, because when the objective becomes the floor, you don't know what they can produce. When it's the ceiling, that's all they can do. They can write the research question. That's all they did. But in this way, it really the values question, and that was a real assignment. It was amazing to see what the students were thinking about in terms of the values, and then how now they're going to be processing that as they go through the creation of their projects. And so, Kelly, the real challenge, that's where the structured autonomy comes in. It's we definitely have course objectives, right? If there's no purposes for a course, then the course has no purpose. But so how do we help them frame the objectives? How do we help them come up with those good objectives through that rubric example that I shared? But giving them that ownership, and then understanding that there are a number of different ways that you can demonstrate your knowledge. I'm great at multiple choice tests. That doesn't mean I learned anything. Some people are great at writing poems that demonstrate their knowledge. It's amazing when you give the students choice what they will do. I had students it was a simple assignment, and then they created a 35-minute podcast because they just loved it. It had the music and the sultry voice. It was amazing. And then at the end, of course, I had them say, explain how identify the 5 concepts that you incorporated in this podcast, and explain, how your choice of media conveyed that. It was amazing. Transparency is so huge. The inclusive teaching and transparent structure being one, transparency being the other. It's so important. When you tell the students exactly what to do in the sense of identify, explain, synthesize, they'll do it, and they'll do it in ways that are really creative. And it can empower students for sure. And Sherry, I'm so glad you said that, because the normal thing is you have to create ambiguity for critical thinking, and that's just not true. The research is clear that critical thinking is a cognitive skill that's specific to domains, and you have to teach students the skills to think critically. Ambiguity does not help students become critical thinkers. Scaffolding a process of metacognition is what helps students become critical thinkers. And you're going to scaffold that process in your domain, which is going to be different in law than it is in art, than it is in engineering. And yeah, so Amber, the whole point of iterative process, constantly, we should never penalize students for developing knowledge, right? And that's one of the undergirding principles here, is we have to give them the space it's not just about turn this in and get the grade. It's about do this thing because it's going to help you learn. It's about practicing. And practical. And again, that's what's really exciting. The learner-drivenness is I don't know what practical means to you, but I'm going to let you do that, because practical to one student might be acing the praxis exam at the end. That might be their practical. And another ones, it could be, I just want to do this thing in my classroom or something. So thank you. Those were all excellent. So give me just a sec here. You can fill out this if you want a copy of the slides. Just gives me your name. Not for any purpose, but I do like to connect with people. Just so I have your contact, and if you email me, then I'll know why you're emailing me. And so very last slide here. So I have this book, Creating Online Transformative Communities, overpriced on Amazon. I don't really make any money, but you could purchase it if it was interesting to you. A lot of the concepts that I talked about were in that. We had developed, my partner and I developed an online discussion forum. So we talked about tools. Years ago, we beta tested it. We had over 4,000 users at 30 universities, and we're recreating it. We'll be launching it in the fall. So if you want early access, just fill out that form. I won't spam you at all. Again, if you put in that code at the end of it, it just lets me know where you came in contact. And so we have 3 phases of discussion: posting, responding, synthesizing, which is awesome. And we scaffold the students' responses. We actually do all of these learner-driven principles. We give students at least 20 different ways to think about responding to a topic that are really meaningful. So it's like basically that example that you saw of a discussion, but in an automated format. So to Amber's query, you don't have to set up anything. It's all set up for you. And we have interactive graphics for you to kind of explore, the students to explore different themes and ideas of interest to help them actually make sense of the knowledge that they're sharing together. So that's a personal plug. I'm just an academic struggling to make it, but we love the app. So that's my presentation. I thank you for your time. Do you have any questions for me? Any comments, any lingering issues left unanswered? So we're right on schedule here. Truly appreciate the participation throughout. This presentation totally fails if no one is commenting, if no one is working on those sheets. Thank you, Amber. Thanks, Max. Appreciate it. T Miller 8. It's fun to say. Thank you, Denise. Doug, I appreciate it. And if you can fork out the overpriced for that book, I appreciate it for sure. And you know, the information is great, but an hour of me is pretty much all anyone can take.
Thank you so much, Patrick. This was fantastic. A quick hour, to be honest with you. That went by really quickly, and I think it's a testimony to what you're preaching here. So certainly, I learned a lot, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone. This was a great experience. I had not interacted with your community, so I am really honored to have been invited to be a part of it.